It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we finally have our big, giant Q&A. John, before we get into it, how the heck are you this Thanksgiving week?
Get back to me at the end of the week after Thanksgiving, and I'll let you know how I did.
Are you good? Do you have big plans to eat a whole lot of food?
Some plans. Gonna visit. I'm not in my mom and my brother. They're in Minnesota. I'm out in LA. When my girlfriend's, she's back out in Wisconsin. So I'm all basically here alone. So I'm gonna spend it with some friends, and I do not know what the food. I got a feeling the food situation's just gonna fall through the cracks and be horse shit.
Aw, you should make some food.
No, I'm not doing jack. My friend normally his daughter takes care of everything. She's in Paris for some godforsaken reason, and so we're stuck. I think foraging through the fridge for whatever leftovers we have.
Hot wings.
Yeah, well, people might know I'm mostly not 100%, but I'm mostly vegetarian. So if certain people aren't listening, I'm going to eat so much meat.
When you told me, I've known you've been mostly pescatarian for a couple of years, but about 6 months ago, you told me I ate a steak. It was when you were in Paris. You told me I ate a steak.
Well, I still between us, as long as no one shares this, I still occasionally eat a steak. I just eat one, like once a month or so.
Yeah.
That's my red meat intake for the month. And then I eat fish a couple times a week. But a good steak's good. I had a burger in Paris though.
Yeah, but you had a steak too.
I gotta tell you, their hamburgers are amazing over there.
You had a steak too. It was either in Paris or when you went home. I just remember you told me.
Yeah. I don't think it wasn't in Paris. I think I was traveling somewhere and I had a steak. Yeah, it was good. But it was an excellent steak. Where was that? There was an amazing steak I had. Oh yeah, we went out to a restaurant. Oh my God, it was so good. So good. Like one of the best steaks I've ever had.
See, now I'm craving a steak. We got to stop talking food here.
Yeah.
I guess
the good news is there is, if you are vegan, which I am mostly, I guess, by not 100% by my own choice, as I'm sure people can detect by this conversation as I whisper. But there are some restaurants out here in the Los Angeles area that are amazing. So you're not missing too much, but I still miss some stuff.
Okay. So I guess we need to get into this because it's a big one. I was surprised with how much response we got for the Q&A. Lots and lots of questions. We got plenty with, with their tag names from social media, but we also got several that wanted to remain anonymous. So if you didn't want to remain anonymous, we will be announcing your tag so that you get credit for the question. So without any further ado, we're going to dive right in. Our first question comes from Phantom Punch Breakdowns. I'm going to give you his Blue Sky handle because that is where he hit us up. So on Blue Sky, he's Phantom Punch and his @ is @9H6ST21. So basically the letters and numbers that spell Ghost 21. That's .bsky.social. And his question is, what are your thoughts on Don Davis making the worst possible decisions for his promotion? And what he's referencing, he gave 2 examples: hiding the girl who fell into the coma after a weight cut, and not honoring fighters' contracts from Bellator like Patricio, Gegard, Patchy Mix, Corey Anderson, etc.
Well, first we should note that was the Diane Silva, right? That went into the coma, and she came out today, my understanding, out of the coma. So that's good news to hear. The worst possible decisions, there might be other. I'm trying to think through history. Elite XC and IFL, all of them have made terrible decisions. Don Davis, a lot of his worst decisions, I think, are based from the MMA side, we look at as terrible, and they're from where he's going, because he's not selling to us, the audience. He's selling to potential investors and broadcasters, people that don't care about MMA. Some of his stuff is probably working, but I would say that my thoughts on the when the woman fell in a coma, their argument, I guess, what they claim, PFL, is that her family requested that they don't talk about it. That's a good defense, because no one wants to go against the family wishes, but you had to know it was going to get out. It's going to look bad. So that's a terrible decision not to get in front of that. That's a terrible PR. On the other one, though, not honoring the fighter contracts from Bellator, Pitbull, Musasi, all those, Patchy Mix, there's a bunch of other people talking about them having problems too. I would argue that's not a mistake. We look at that and go, that's a terrible decision by them. But from their point of view, and this is the sad truth, is I think they bought Bellator to acquire Bellator to make we're making this big move. We're the number 2. Now look at this. But remember, their selling point, when Don Davis does an interview, what does he talk about? Look at all the ranked fighters we have. We have this percentage of fights are ranked fighters in Fight Matrix, this percentage. On the investor decks that they have, you look at them, they talk about, look at all the ranked fighters that compare to the UFC. So when they acquired Bellator, they got the talking points they want to sell to investors and broadcasters and stuff. That's what they're looking for. What it doesn't seem like they're looking for is to actually put these guys to put these guys in fights against each other for us, the fans. And so for them, their best move for Don Davis, sadly, is let's acquire them. We can now list off all the top fighters we have. They're ranked in the top 10, top 25. But what's also we can do is not have them fight and save money. Because what we're doing is we're trying to pitch a sales pitch to people that don't really watch MMA. And I think that's what's going on. In fact, someone submitted me a question. I told you this earlier, Stephanie, that had to do with PFL. And it's so long-winded, I didn't include it today but we will come back to that in the future, because I will have to craft everything about all the mistakes PFL and other promotions are making. MMA fans, this is terrible that these guys aren't getting fights, but I have to say, I do not think this is a terrible decision from his point of view.
So business-wise, it makes sense for them.
I mean, it doesn't make sense if you're trying to make an actual MMA promotion that draws fans.
Right.
But if you're trying just to craft a sales pitch, having them on your roster is good. But what's also bad is if you had to actually pay them. So not having them fight takes care of that.
How long can they get away with that? I'm just wondering. I
mean, that's the question. They will be in violation of the contract at some point. I'm sure they have really strict contracts, but there is a point where you're not offering the fights and they'll violate. The question is, will a lot of these fighters push back and demand that their contracts be ripped up? Because the market is, do I want to stay with PFL where I have a contract that pays me a large sum of money? Or do I want that contract terminated, be put on the market, and really there's only one major buyer of my services right now? Maybe I can go to Ryzen if I'm lucky, but right now it's UFC. Mm-hmm. And maybe the UFC doesn't want to pay me a lot. So a lot of these fighters, because the marketplace is so weak, because there's so little competition, because there's basically the UFC and whoever's arguing that they're the rival to the UFC at that time, because that's your only options. There's very little choices, these very bad choices these fighters have to make, basically. Do I want to, I have a contract that pays me good compared to what the MMA market usually makes, but they're not giving me fights. So do I want them to rip up that contract and potentially get a contract that doesn't pay me good, but maybe I get more fights?
Next question. We're seeing this one come from Nick Wilson, and his handle on Blue Sky is @CrazyKudu. That's KrazyKudu.Bluesky Social. His question is, with the upcoming end of the UFC ESPN broadcast deal and a greater emphasis on extracting site fees for traveling around, why does the UFC seem so stubbornly committed to having all these goddamn Apex cards? All of that direct quote.
Well, because they want to keep those site fees super high. I mean, they say they're going to have less Apex cards going next year. I think part of it's because they're doing more international fights more than anything. But we talked about that, by having fewer cards around the country, they can jack up the price because there's more scarcity for the live event. And I think they said they are not getting, they might have less Apex cards, but they're not getting rid of it. And one reason they're not getting rid of it is because they can charge an arm and a leg. They can jack up the prices for their events because people are starved for the chance to go to a UFC event. And they're part of, not even in their home city because they're doing fewer cities, in their part of the country, let's say driving distance.
And then you have the Apex with this massive expansion coming up. I feel like they're probably going to dump a lot more in there. Maybe not in 2025, but by the time 2026 gets here, we might be seeing more, right? Since they're expanding it.
I don't know if they'll do more UFC events because they'll start selling, you'll have more tickets available, which means you'll have less scarcity, but so they might want to go around more. But I think they'll start doing more non-UFC events there.
But they expanded it so that they could have an audience in there.
Yes, exactly. I can't remember what the size is. It's at least 1,000, I think.
Yeah.
But so there'll be something of it. They don't want to have too big of an audience because, again, they don't want to have too many tickets available. But I think what they're going to do is kind of continue. They're going to have lower tier events. And maybe the Apex is, because Apex charges these tremendous VIP ticket prices. So maybe it's wearing off the interest level for the VIPs that were paying a ton to go see these events.
$1,600, my goodness, for an Apex card. So
maybe they're looking at they'll make more on the 1,000, but they don't want too many tickets because, again, they want to starve the fan base to pay more. And they are very good at using ticket brokers and releasing a smaller percentage of the tickets available to make sure the ticket prices stay as high as possible throughout the sale. All
right. Next question is coming from Sam. He is at ssb3037.bluesky.social. His question: is a PFL UFC cross-promotional title unification bout possible between John Jones and Francis Ngannou if the Saudis or that Turkey dude get involved in it with a lot of cash?
I mean, hypothetically, yes. If they just slapped on tons of money, I don't think the UFC is going to say no. It's going to be like Conor versus Mayweather, that kind of money. But it's not going to happen because, one, that's not necessary. And it's namely not necessary because Ngannou's got one fight left with the PFL deal. So UFCs can argue, we do not want to cross-promote with PFL. We would rather wait till Francis' contract's done, and then we can make a pitch to ourselves. Now, it's possible Francis can't come to terms with the UFC. And it'd be interesting to see how interested the UFC is in making, this fight, because one of Francis' demands would be probably a contract similar to the PFL one, where it's only like 2 fights and no options. And it's, people are like, well, the UFC doesn't need fighters. Well, then why do they demand that the fighters sign contracts they can't get out of? Right? Why, if fighters are important, why do they demand that they sign an agreement that if they win, they're stuck there? So it would be interesting to see if the UFC now would make an offer to them for that. But also it's possible Francis wouldn't agree to fight for the UFC in the terms. The cross promotion I think is more possible is a kind of a UFC deal where Francis signs short term with the UFC and the Saudis, for whatever reason, put up the tremendous site fee, and a larger chunk of that goes to Francis to cover his purse. So they cover the pay for Francis Ngannou. That's kind of, it wouldn't be cross promotion because they would do it under the UFC label. But that to me seems much more plausible, where the Saudis are picking up the tab for Francis and kind of, vouching for him that he doesn't have to sign the long-term agreement that the UFC demands. But I doubt the UFC's in a position where I think they're in better relationship with the Saudis than Francis is. And they also, again, they're repeat players. For some reason, and I think we all know what that reason is, they are unwilling to work with people on short terms or cross promote. So I think that remains. They keep doing it that way. Businesses seem to be working for them that way. Maybe not for other people, but for them, it's been working. So they're going to keep doing it that way.
But there is like a tiny, tiny sliver of light down that dark tunnel towards possibly a fight for Francis and John. I think it went that way.
I think there is a chance. And one, I mean, Dana says, I'll never work with him. He's a bad dude. Was Conor McGregor. I would be interested if Dana plans on working with Conor McGregor now.
Right.
But if France, but they have this new contract coming up. And one thing, if Francis finishes his deal next year, while they're negotiating, one thing they could sell to any new contracts, like, listen, you guys don't have to worry. We're going to have a series of massive heavyweight bouts coming up. Pay us a ton of money. You are set. We got John Jones and Tom Aspinall, and we got Francis, and we got, possibly Alex Pereira. We can put on a series of massive heavyweight fights on your platform. And I think that would be a strong, whatever they had to give into Francis. Again, they're not going to give in like it's not like boxing where they're going to make a deal that's fair all around. But I could imagine them saying, hey, we will work with you again, Ngannou. We will pay you, what we're offering, kind of what a little more than we offered you before in the ballpark. And we will do a shorter contract term, less options and extensions, all the stuff you want. But no, you get no equity, you get no piece on the board, you get none of that stuff. And Ngannou, depending on where his position is, he might say yes. Of course, Ngannou is in a tremendous spot because the PFL wants to negotiate a TV deal after the UFC. They kind of need him because they have no one else to market with, and he could probably say, well, PFL, you better pay me even more than you're paying me now to stick around.
All right. Our next question comes from our old colleague, Jack Wanan. He is at Jack Wanan. That's with two N's. It's Jack and Wannan. I hope I haven't mangled your name, sir. He is on X, Twitter, whatever you call it these days. His question is, how much, if at all, do you think the antitrust suit has made people more aware or interested in fighter pay discussions? I'm curious if you two have seen any sort of changes in fan behavior around it or none.
Jack, who's at, if I remember, he's at Post Wrestling now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You know what? I've seen a little bit of change in behavior. I'm not going to say it's been a tremendous change. I think the things that really changed the conversation about fighter pay was one, the sale to Endeavor, when people saw the price tag, right? And then, and this is from the fighter lawsuit, but not directly, is when the wage share got released. And people, when Jorge Masvidal and others would repeat it, they didn't cite it coming from the lawsuit, though. You don't remember that? They would just cite like it was common knowledge. But when people learned that that was the actual number that the UFC was paying and that they'd sold the company for $4 billion, I think that increased a lot of fighter pay discussions. Now, in the last year, I guess we've had continuing more, but because of the turnover in fan base, in many ways, I see a lot of fans regressing back to the previous conversations. You see a lot of them throwing around, we don't know the real numbers. We don't know, they're pay that's not counted. This is fair pay. What do you expect? All the stuff that after the sale and after the wage share came out, a lot of people had decided that, okay, now we have the evidence. This is, kind of unfair. But because of the fan turnover, we're now back to where we were. So I think that's the change in fan behavior I've seen. We're now in a weird way, we've gone far enough that we're now back to almost where we started, where we have a lot of fans who would finally admit, yes, the UFC pays too little. Yes, it's unfair what they pay. They take advantage of the market more than we would in the past. But we have less people saying that than we did a few years ago.
Our next 6 questions were all submitted anonymously. First one, is it possible the UFC could be sold to the Saudis / Turki Alalsheikh group, where not only they would have control over boxing, but the largest pie of MMA? How likely could this happen? And if it did, what do you think would change?
I mean, I do think it's possible. I don't know if Turki Alalsheikh would be the guy to do it, but the PIF could do it, someone else over there. But I do think it's possible. I mean, it does. I think it's more possible they buy a large share in TKO, right? But again, it's very possible they do. I don't know how their control of boxing is going. In some ways, their control of boxing, and maybe the same would happen in the UFC, is yes, they're spending more and boxers are making a ton. Usyk and Fury they're going to make over 100 million each this year. But interest in boxing it seems to take a pretty big hit in the United States in large part because the fights are moving into Saudi Arabia and they have no interest in presenting it in a way that's easily digestible by the American audience. So there's a lot less interest I see in these events in America And the same thing could happen in the UFC. So I think we've talked about, me and you off the air about this, that we think it's a plausible scenario that the Saudis could heavily invest in the UFC and possibly buy it. Much more plausible than them investing in a competitor, right? Why put tons of money in a competitor when you just give the UFC that ton of money and control them? But I think it's more plausible that they buy a chunk of it, and from that chunk they demand a certain number of events in Saudi Arabia and have some control. What would change is if the events are focused more on Saudi Arabia and their money, I think there'd be less interest. It's possible there'd be less interest in North America for the product.
All right. Why are so many people afraid to name Ari Emanuel and Mark Shapiro as the key leaders of UFC decisions rather than Dana White?
I don't know if people are afraid to, but they don't name them. I think it's less to do with being afraid to name those two. Well, I guess some people are afraid. People in the MMA, people covering MMA, I don't think are afraid. It's that they don't know those guys. And Dana White is the figurehead. Sounds derogatory, but he is the mascot of the UFC. So when people say Dana White makes a decision, I think they're really just saying the UFC executives of whatever unnamed executive I can't name made a decision. I'm going to say Dana White as a surrogate for them. So I think that's why people use Dana White. They built an image of him as the guy running the UFC. It's understandable why people, even if they know better, and I do this too, I often will say Dana White, and I don't mean Dana White literally. I just mean Dana White is the representation of the UFC. So, that makes sense. But people more than know, and people that follow business, or I should say more people that are involved in the business, I think they don't want to name them because they don't want to get on their bad side. Those guys are, their power is well beyond the UFC. And that's why I think like Sports Business Journal and other, maybe Hollywood Reporter, companies that would know that the decision-making is coming from the top, that follow TKO, I think they might not want to cross them, podcasts too as well, because these guys are extremely powerful, influential in the media landscape, well beyond anything we saw at the Fertittas. Fertittas could intimidate MMA media, but if Emanuel or Shapiro want to, they can intimidate, mainstream media.
I mean, they're kind of kingmakers, right? Sort of, or at least a party too.
Yeah, they are. I mean, listen, if you're in the actor or something and you want to get a project made, they represent a lot of actors, talent. They have projects they put together. They do the scripts, all that. They build the projects. You're like, I don't want to piss them off. If you're a network, you're like, well, maybe I want to do a story about how bad the UFC is treating fighters. But I'm like, well, at the same time, we're negotiating with those guys to get stuff on our network from them. We can't have a hassle with that. They're getting investment. They're the ones, doing investments for us on my other businesses. And they're getting, let's say I own a piece of an NBA team. They're the guys doing a lot of the media rights and stuff. So they they represent on all fronts. So there's a lot of people that that maybe want to say something about one of their ventures poorly, but they're like, well, I work with them on so many other things. I don't want to. I want to cross them on this one minor thing when I have to work with them and I'm dependent on them for all these other things.
We've said this before, but my favorite way to describe Dana White is he's the Queen Elizabeth of the UFC. Basically, he's the figurehead.
That's a pretty good analogy. He's the royalty we've created that represents, he's the physical manifestation of the nationhood.
Yep. All right. So next question. Why are so many people treating government control of fight sports as taboo? And in parentheses, this person has Abu Dhabi has as much, if not more control than KSA. First, what is KSA?
Oh, that is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
So I don't know if they have more. I mean, they have more control in the sense that they were invested in the UFC and they have a stronger relationship with some. But I mean, just the reason everybody's focused in Saudi Arabia is they're spending so much more than everybody else, even in that region. I mean, the site fees the UFC was bragging about are for a pay-per-view are 2 or 3 times as much from Saudi Arabia. So I think that's why everybody's catering to the Saudis more than the United Arab Emirates. But why are so many people treating government control of fight sports as taboo? I don't know if they're treating it as taboo. I just think they're not aware of the influence. I guess the normal fan is not aware of the influence these governments have, how much they're putting into besides the sports washing articles. The people in government and business that are aware of it, they want to do government and business. They look at it like easy money. They are addicted. The amount of money they're throwing around is just mouth watering to these people. People that before would say they would never work with Saudi Arabia for what they did to a journalist. Now they're erasing any conversation they had where they said that and walking over with their hand out is get as much money as they can from them. So I think, the simple answer is, I don't know if it's taboo as much as people want that money, and the people that in the know want the money and don't want to say anything about it, and the people not in the know are just not in the know.
Could it also be, too, that UFC is actively replacing interviews with real media with interviews with influencers and their own curated sector of the media?
I think that's part of it, not just UFC. I mean, our media has become fragmented. Part of the problem in America, too, is our mainstream media, ever since CNN took off, there's a whole thing you go back about how media used to be differently. Ever since CNN took off, media has been dependent on its financial interest. It's a financial venture where before network news was an item you had to invest in because the government basically forced you to get the airtime. But ever since CNN, it's become a lucrative profit investment by people that are into it. And so on one hand is that we've splintered the media and people ignore mainstream media and they get their information from podcasts. And the other thing is everybody is what we in the old days we call a sellout. Even the mainstream media and the podcast, everybody's looking for how they can improve their money they make. And if these guys are dishing money out, no one wants to get on their bad side, right? And if you don't care about Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, well, the people that are representing you, again, Emanuel and Mark Shapiro, are getting money from them, and they're probably telling you, hey, don't badmouth them because we want to be in business with these guys. So the tentacles run deep. Selling out means nothing anymore. Everything's done for money. And if everything's done for money, the guys with money get a lot of influence. And that's the people in the Middle East right now who are sitting on a lot of money.
Next question. The UFC is now the world's biggest sport without an antitrust exemption and complete and total protection legally, financially, and politically with the U.S. government. What will it take to pierce that bubble?
Well, I mean, their antitrust exemption is not granted anymore by Congress. It's granted by having a collective bargaining agreement with the athletes. And UFC doesn't want that because they're a single entity monopoly. So what would it take to pierce the bubble? I mean, I think we were close to that with the antitrust case. There was there's a reason, we were close to that. I think there was a chance with the FTC. I'll get into it later. The FTC or DOJ or someone looking into the UFC about their antitrust violations beyond just the civil action going on. So I think, what will it take to burst the bubble? I guess, will the new Brundysians that were in the Biden administration, will they be back in the future? I think it'll take that. I'm not 100% certain they'll be back. I think, it might be a generation, and which is the UFC is probably counting on 20 years from now before we see the neo Brundysians, the guys that want, antitrust enforcement brought back in a major way. It'll take those guys, and then coming back into part of the Lena Khans, the Cantors, all them to pierce the bubble of their quasi antitrust, their de facto antitrust exemption they have.
Will Trump's new labor secretary, backed by Sean O'Brien, have any impact at all on the independent contractor classification? Will there be an Endeavor TKO carve-out?
No, I think the opposite will happen. I mean, I think the new labor secretary, as much as they claim they're pro-union and they're for the PRO Act, there's no chance the PRO Act passes, so that doesn't really matter. I think they've already hinted that the Trump administration will go back to the previous Trump administration's independent contractor classification standards, which makes it harder to be classified as an employee. So I think the UFC will be safe on that front. And if everything's to be believed, I mean, when Leslie Smith filed her suit, I mean, it does sound, I've heard stuff that makes it sound very believable. It's basically someone from the Trump administration. I don't know if it was Trump himself personally, but let's say someone, I guess more Federalist Society leaning member, called the NLRB to kick out her hearing. So I imagine the same would work in a Trump administration, the second Trump administration here, the new Trump administration.
The first antitrust case was Kung Lee versus Zuffa et al. Is the second antitrust case named defendant still the same? Is it Zuffa et al., or did it change since the UFC was sold in 2016 to Endeavor? And, this case is from 2017 to present.
Well, it's different in the sense that the named plaintiffs, it's named after Cajun Johnson, and the other members of the lawsuit are Clarence Dalloway. I guess that's CB's real name, Clarence Dalloway, and I think Tristan Connolly is now the third named plaintiff on it. And it's not V. Zuffa anymore. Before it was V. Zuffa DBA, does business as Ultimate Fighting Championship UFC. Now it's the Zuffa LLC, TKO operating company, Zuffa Parent, and Endeavor Group Holdings. So they are suing all those firms, and you can kind of understand why they're suing them. One is, Zuffa and the UFC, just like the previous one, are the same entity that just does business in different names. TKO Operating Company is now the owner of Zuffa and the UFC, and Endeavor for a while was the owner. But interesting enough, Endeavor has filed a motion to get taken off that, and the plaintiffs are fighting that motion. And their argument is that Endeavor, I think their argument is basically they don't want to make it so they want to guarantee they're going to get some sort of settlement in the future. By TKO and UFC being an independent company now, they would alone be responsible for the settlement. And they're like, well, Endeavor owns a majority of TKO, gets a management fee of like $50 million, $100 million now from TKO. Their fingers are in the pot. All the same executives run it. Really, you've set up TKO as some sort of, kind of protection mechanism for yourself that TKO can be left holding the bag if something bad happens. And so the plaintiffs still want Endeavor as part of the defendants, and Endeavor wants out because they would like it to be self-contained to TKO, and that Endeavor would not be responsible for any of the damages.
Okay, this one comes from Lord of Valinor on X. He says, what do y'all think it will take to make the UFC machine crumble since the class action suits didn't really lead to a breakup?
Well, I don't think, even in the class action, I've said before, I didn't think it would break up the UFC. I think it would just, even the best case scenario, worst case scenario, if they would have went into trial and the UFC demanded a trial, let's say there was no settlement around 2019, before the 2018 or something, before the, a few years after they filed it, before they got the ESPN deal, then it possibly, because the damages, if they got damages and they're trebled and they enforced injunctive relief, the UFC would be in serious trouble at that point because they have so much debt. But ever since they got that ESPN deal, and they make so much money now, almost nothing's going to break up the UFC. They just would have to, the contracts could be weakened, or they would have to pay more. I don't think you can, the UFC crumble the machine though. I think the biggest thing would be, more than any damages, is you got to do one of two things. One is you got to weaken the contracts to the point where fighters can freely move on to other places while they have their value. For all the talk that people always say, like the UFC don't need the fighters need the UFC. Well, they seem very protective on holding the fighters there. Ngannou leaves, and then they instantly make sure no one else can follow his footsteps. That tells me, as much as the UFC is so big, they think fans might follow some of those fighters. I got a feeling, right? And so they want to make sure they don't leave. So that's one, is you got to make sure the contracts, which is probably the biggest one, make sure the contracts are, they're so short, so unrestrictive that fighters can freely move around. Because what that does is several big name fighters, yes, they might be in the UFC now, but 1 or 2 years from now, maybe they go somewhere else. and fans might pay to see them. And then those fighters have leverage to demand more money. So that'd be one. The second one is one a lot of fans don't like, is the idea that the championship cannot belong to the promoter. And the reason the championship, because that's how you do coercive contracts. Fighters fight to fight for a championship. Becoming a champion makes you more valuable. If the UFC is the one place where everybody respects the title, then that means the UFC can hold that and say, you have to sign an agreement with us on our terms, or you never get a chance to fight for this title. And so if you had the titles, objective rankings, and the titles were no longer bound by the promoter, or the promoter had no control over who got to fight for it, there was guidelines that had to be followed, that would vastly increase the fighter's leverage with the UFC. You could have the UFC still running everything, but not running everything. I should say they don't run the titles, but the UFC could still be the big dog, but they'd be forced to pay more, because if someone became champion and someone became the number one challenger under the system where the UFC doesn't control the rankings, does not control the title, then they could go somewhere else. And again, a group of fans, a large, sizable number of fans would probably follow them just for that fight. If John Jones tomorrow was free to go somewhere else and he was going to fight Tom Aspinall or Francis Ngannou, maybe the fight wouldn't be as big as it is in the UFC, but I think it would be big enough that those guys would probably make more than what the UFC would offer them. And so I think that's the two things you'd have to see. Now, how do you get there? The titles, you'd have to get some sort of congressional action. That seems pretty unrealistic. The contracts, I think the one chance was, and I don't think people understand how close we got to this, is that the DOJ or the FTC does an investigation of the UFC and decides that the UFC's contracts the UFC has monopolized the sport. Their contracts are a means they're doing that, and we are going to put restrictions on that. And so that's the only two ways those happen. And right now, with Trump coming back in, I think there's no chance either of those happen at all.
All right, this next question comes from Mind of B. He is at Mind of B1 on X. And he says, why has there not been a heavyweight boxing champion that has been on the megastar level post Mike Tyson? And do you think that may be a big reason the business of boxing has fallen behind quite a few other sports since then? Before Mike Tyson, there was Muhammad Ali, Jack Dempsey, Jack Johnson, John L. Sullivan, who were heavyweight champs that were all pretty much not only the biggest athlete, but the biggest stars of their era.
Okay, I think there's a couple reasons we have not had a big boxing superstar like Mike Tyson since Mike Tyson. And I do think you might be onto something. I do think that without that heavyweight champ, because the heavyweight champ is the one that for decades everybody viewed that was the centerpiece of boxing, and that might have kind of hurt boxing's overall appeal without having the baddest man on the planet anymore. And I think the number one reason why is we have not had anything. We just haven't had another Mike Tyson since Mike Tyson or Evander Holyfield. Americans have not dominated the heavyweight championship, right? The big heavyweight championships were Lennox Lewis and Klitschko for decades, basically decades. You add up their runs. And then, now the UK with Fury and Joshua. Wilder probably had a shot, but did not defeat Joshua or Fury to kind of cement him place as the number one. So he probably would have been a much bigger star if he did. But he never got close to that because he didn't beat them. So we haven't had anybody that the universally recognized as the number one boxer that's an American and charismatic, like a Tyson in his own way. Ali was incredibly charismatic. I think that's one major reason. The other major reason, I think, is just the way what's happened to boxing overall is, fans criticize the sanctioning organizations. I think there's some truth to that criticism. I think some of it's exaggerated by MMA fans, but ever since, the ring scandal in the 70s, and then we should get Kurt Emhoff on here. He knows all the different scandals that splintered up the sanctioning organizations. But ever since then, there's been this creation of multiple sanctioning organizations from overseas that didn't denote who's the champion of whatever sanctioning organization. Before, fans generally knew this was the number one guy. Didn't matter what belt he held, but it was universally accepted who the champion was. Now the champions are splintered, which, and it's not that they're splintered and can't be unified and undisputed. It's that they're splintered and no one really understands what makes a guy become champion in the first place. So, for decades, we had, less media to contend with. So when a big boxing event happened and you knew it was the champion, you knew it was this big guy, the big challenger that everybody kind of heard of, it'd create a big event. The world could stop and we could watch it. Now we're in a more fractured media and a more fractured sanctioning organization title landscape. And I think you combine those and it makes it harder to find. It makes it harder for matches to break through. When they do, they're massive. Mayweather, Pacquiao, Mayweather, Canelo, Triple G. They're still big boxing matches, but it's less and less breakthrough, and it's harder for, I think, the casual fan to follow, especially when there's so many other things. So you put those two together, the splintered nature of boxing, the more splintered nature of boxing, and the more the more competition the media on one, and on top of that, no American champions, no charismatic American champions really since Tyson. I go Evander Holyfield a little bit. He had something going. He sold a few pay-per-views when he was champion. But since then, and you put those together, and I think that has really hurt the boxing business in the United States.
All right. Our next question comes from @Amazin281664437 on X. And his question is, I see two extremes with the Johnson case. I see a huge loss for the UFC where the business gets upended and they lose a lot of their market share. Then I see the other extreme where absolutely nothing happens. I don't think either of these extremes happen. I don't think the UFC gets away completely unscathed. My question is, what is a realistic and most likely middle ground outcome for the Johnson fighters and the MMA market as a whole?
He's 100% right. I think you're 100% right. The two extremes are the two extremes. When we talked about the Lee case, I would talk about basically the extremes. If they lose, they get nothing. If the fighters win and the damage trebles, there's just all, cats and dogs are living in peace and there's, frogs raining from the sky. It's Armageddon. But people would then tune out and not listen when I got to the middle ground, the most likely scenarios. So yes, the extremes are extreme, but very unlikely in Johnson. I think I'm going to give you two very possible middle grounds, depending on what happens with the arbitration agreement. If the arbitration agreements, the class action waivers are upheld, we've now shrunk the pool greatly. We will have a settlement. We're always going to have a settlement because no one wants to go to trial, but we will have a settlement that will be for less money than what we just saw for the Lee case. I'm not sure how much less, but let's say 200 million total. The total amount of fighters that are not covered by the class action waivers, I think their earnings are about 450 million, so a little bit less than what the Lee class made. But there'll be no injunctive relief at all. That will be the end of the Lee class if those class action waivers are upheld. And also, I guess for the fighters, if the class action waiver is upheld, the 200 million will be split amongst a few hundred fighters. I can't remember if it's 400 or 500, 600, and the other 1,000 fighters that have fought since then will get like $4,000. They will get almost nothing. No matter how much they made, they can make tens of millions in their UFC career. They'll get $4 million if they have that class action waiver. That's one likely outcome. The other one is if those arbitration agreements, class action waivers are ruled unenforceable by the court. Well, now the size of the pool grows greatly. The UFC will settle. They will settle not just because they have for more than the Lee class, not just because there are more damages potentially because there's more fighters in the pool who earn more money. They're also injunctive relief is back on the table. I think they will settle for an amount, multiples, maybe, I don't know what the total earnings of the fighters are. I think it was twice. Let's say the fighters earned, when the class period is done, that they earned $1.5 billion compared to the 556 million during the Lee period. So 3 times as much. I think they will settle for 4 or 5 times as much, right? Much more than what they got. So you're talking over $1 billion in settlement, closer to like 60, 70%, maybe more of what their total earnings were compared to the 35-40% they did during the or I should say, it was 60%, I believe, during the Lee class, the settlement. I will say it'll be close to 100% for the Johnson period on the settlement. So much larger pool of money to be split amongst the fighters. And then on top of it, there will be contract changes, maybe not the 2-year agreement, but you will look at changes like what was in the Ngannou contract. And I think it'll be slightly better than that as a settlement, because the risk of losing in trial without those waivers is so great that the UFC is like, we will cave in on a lot of this. We will have maybe instead of a 5-year sunset, a 4-year sunset, no retirement provision, making it separate, a maximum declinations, things like that. That will be very beneficial to fighters. Another one I would just throw out to make up, because I think they're asking for is, fighters can take a certain amount of video material to use in promotion on wherever they go. So things like that would tremendously help fighters, but not the things that will really upturn the industry completely. So that's, I think, the two most realistic possibilities.
All right, our next question comes from Stefan Sommer. That's STEFANSOMMER.bluesky.social. His question is, to what do you attribute the UFC's turn to blatant conservatism? Is it a business strategy to align with a particular customer base? Is it a byproduct of Dana White's personal views writ large across the company? Or is it something else, like a long play to get Chimaev back in the USA?
I mean, I think it's all these, except, not really Chimaev, but yes, a long play and something else. But it's all of them. I think what happened, my understanding of what happened is Dana White spoke because he's actually friends with Donald Trump, or knows him, and, they have a relationship, at the 2016 convention for the Republicans. Because of that, Endeavor, who had bought the company and were looking to get sponsored, realized, figured out that there are conservatively owned companies that will put money into the UFC because they look at it as a conservative alternate to the other sports. Why? Because the other sports had that kneeling issue at the time. Athletes kneeling, they knew that the UFC wouldn't do that, and the UFC president had just spoke at the Republican convention. And so the UFC started targeting conservative-run companies. The companies themselves might not have been conservative, but the ownership was. And these were often, not A-list sponsorship levels, B, C tier, low level, but they could get more of them and a higher amount. So the UFC targeted them, and because the UFC targeted them, the more they target them, they had a stronger position in the conservative space. And one of the UFC employees went to go work in Donald Trump's campaign. So when Donald Trump came back, they made the decision that UFC is known as this kind of anti-woke, conservative-friendly sport. We are going to use that to our benefit. UFC was very happy to help them, because in exchange, the UFC now, after the Biden administration came in, were concerned about the leaders, the personnel in the Biden administration, something that they were not concerned about before. Before, it was just Dana White helping his guy out. But you get to 2024, this recent run, they are looking at Biden had appointed Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor. He had an NLRB they were worried about. They, especially, I think, Cantor and Khan. I think there's a lot of, I got to find out more, but there's a lot of evidence that I think they were legitimately concerned that those guys would look into the UFC. One of those departments would, after the settlement in the antitrust suit, because you have this class cert ruling by the judge that is so strong, and because these guys, that's what they live for. And so they have decided, we are going to throw ourselves completely in with Donald Trump, and if he wins, we do not have to worry about these other concerns. And lo and behold, they won. The favor is going to get paid back, that they don't have to worry about any of these agencies. They're going to get Chimaev as a bonus too. They'll probably get him back. And now Dana White's saying he's no longer wants anything to do with politics.
All right. Our next question comes from Pricesters. He is at PTROS.bluesky.social. His question is, Endeavor and the Saudis are owning nearly everything, and now it looks like Endeavor is going hard into the grappling space. Can you guys give me any reasons to be positive about combat sports going forward other than a good fight here and there? And then he has in parentheses, and still with the fighters getting screwed over pay-wise.
Any reason to be positive? Okay. I'm going to try to be positive, but I can't. Honestly, I can't be super positive. If reading the question, I kind of understand what your point of view is. And from your point of view, I'm sure you would like to see athletes have more power, treated better. I guess the one good thing is you will see, and we have a later question I'm going to incorporate into this. Someone later asked us about should they be excited about the UFC signing BJJ athletes to exclusive contracts. It goes hand in with this one. So I'm going to include it here. You should be excited by the fact that the UFC is going to give probably more attention to BJJ now that they're behind it, that you're going to see a little more money into it. But that's going to be the short-term excitement, because long-term is the UFC. The reason they have signing exclusive contracts, the reason they're getting into this is because think they see an opportunity to easily monopolize the sport, just like they did UFC. When you have an exclusive contract, if you read the Ali Act hearings in the 90s when they were doing them, they pointed out that if Wimbledon or if a tennis tournament like Wimbledon demanded exclusive contracts to compete in Wimbledon, what would happen is then Wimbledon would shortly thereafter have control over tennis, because everybody would sign to compete in Wimbledon, exclusive contract. And I think this is the UFC is going to do with this. They're going to have a better jiu-jitsu tournament that pays more than everybody else. It gives you more prestige, gives you more attention. And then after everybody wants to compete and this signs up, and signs an exclusive long-term contract, well, basically that sucks up the whole market. And then you create a network effect where they have all the talent. And if you want to compete with, even be in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu professional game, you will have to sign with the UFC to get noticed. So it's the way you roll up combat sports. So focus on the good times that's going to happen in the first year or two. And maybe not focus on what's going to happen after that. That'd be my advice if you want to find this enjoyable at all.
Good advice. All right, our next question. Now, these last questions were submitted to John, and of course, all he put was a name and not a handle. So I don't know where Finley comes from, if he's coming from X or Blue Sky.
I'm going to point out that was in the comment sections of our Substack, and all it says is Finley. And I imagine this is Finley, our old friend, Finley Beaton.
Okay, that's what I figured too. So Finley has the next two questions. His first question, harking back to your history of pro wrestling episodes, if WWE admits that the fights are fake and scripted, could pro wrestlers be considered actors and be able to join SAG?
Yeah, I think there's been talk of that for a while, that there's some combination between an actor, a stage actor, or TV actor, whether on TV, or a stuntman. And SAG, it makes a lot of sense. More than MMA fighters, as people know, I'm not big on MMA fighters being union members, because just the nature of the business. But pro wrestlers, I think that there's no reason they shouldn't be considered employees, especially the way the WWE treats them. And on top of that, there's no reason why they couldn't form a union. In fact, I think that they are really solid case for forming a union, I think, and working with SAG. In fact, I know SAG officials have offered to help them. I don't think the wrestlers have taken them up on that.
All right, next question, also from Finley. Could the broadcasters that are bidding on UFC content pressure the UFC into a ranking system that is completely separate from the UFC? This way, there is a third party ranking the fighters that are on and particularly headlining the fight cards.
Well, they could. I mean, Fox is the one that came up with the original UFC rankings. A broadcaster could, but they can only, basically push that on them during negotiations before, I don't think they could compel them to take it up after they'd had a contract with you. So they could say, oh, you want to be on our network, you have to use an independent rankings, which would compel the UFC to say, we'll just sign with someone else. We want to control the product as much as possible. We do not want independent rankings introduced where we give fighters a lot more leverage. So they would say no. And I'm sure the broadcasters too wouldn't care. They would, theoretically you could make this argument. Theoretically, they could push this on the UFC, but I don't think the broadcasters would care. They'd just be happy we have the UFC. And I don't think they would want to help any other promoter or fighters out there have leverage with the UFC. They're just, they're in bed with the UFC.
Our next question comes from Martin's Scores 75 PPG, but I don't know which outlet, if it's X, if it's Substack, or if it's Blue Sky.
Blue Sky.
Blue Sky. So Martin's Scores 75 ppg.bluesky.social. His question is, how well is Rizin doing these days? Their New Year's Eve shows look packed every single year. What's their strategy for growth beyond the freak show fights with washed boxers?
Well, I'll answer the last part. What's their strategy? I don't know what their strategy is, to tell you the truth. I think their main strategy is appealing to the Japanese market, and they're thinking about some expansion outside Japanese market, but I think that it's very minimal. They're mostly a Japanese-centric company. But how are they doing? I mean, by all accounts I've heard, I don't know if they're doing gangbusters per se, but they are doing very well. They had a surprise when they got kicked off TV. Not Pride got kicked off, when Rizin lost their TV deal, and they switched to pay-per-view. They just, by luck, found out that they can sell pay-per-views and ended up doing much better financially. And if you look, they have their Bellator show last year, sold several 100,000 pay-per-views, and in Japan, pay-per-views, the way it works, you buy in advance, you get a discount, and on the night of, it's like basically $45 US. So their pay-per-views are not dirt cheap pay-per-views. They are making, when they're selling up to 500,000 pay-per-views in some of these bigger events, they're generating serious money, and they're also selling out massive stadiums and stuff. So they're making millions at the gate on some of these events. And so you look at their total numbers, I think it's pretty clear that they are the number 2 promotion on real dollars produced. Maybe not fake dollars, not the barter transaction stuff that some promotions use, but on real dollars, especially real dollars per event generated. I think they are by far I shouldn't say by far, but they are doing number 2. Now, the problem with Japan is that, we've seen from past promotions, they can start off well and things can turn badly quick. And they have a lot of, there's a certain overhead that they have to up, and I don't know how many fingers are in the, hands are in the cookie jar. So I don't know what they need to make to consistently stay in place, but compared to other promotions, they're generating bigger gates. Their tickets are a higher price than what you see in Poland and Germany with the Octagon and KSW shows. So their gates are higher. They're selling pay-per-views, but only the UFC is the only other one doing it. They're generating pay-per-views that sell, 8-figure plus US dollar amount pay-per-view broadcasts generating. So I would say they are, it looks on the outside for me, they are doing pretty good.
I have an add-on question to that from myself. I happen to notice that when Dana talks about Rizin, or Rizin as he calls it, he's very respectful of them and does not trash them. As a matter of fact, with Kai Asakura coming over, he talked up Rizin, or Rizin as he says. So what's your take on that?
I think a big part is they're not in competition. That the UFC win in Japan failed miserably. I think if you read Zach Arnold, he laid out a bunch of ways that they didn't want to do the Japanese style business. And so for the US, the UFC, it's not in their interest to really target the Japanese market. Now they actually make money because there's an MMA fan base, a hardcore fan base that buys pays to watch it on whatever, I can't remember what network they use right now. So there's money to be made, but they're not going to have the crossover appeal because they don't even want to do the type of business necessary to succeed in Japan. So I think they've decided, we can be friendly with Rizin because we are not competing with them. And as long as Rizin does not compete with the UFC, which they really don't, it's not Pride Days when they are willing to pay to get fighters to leave the UFC to come over. Right. So there's there's not the threat from them, and they're not expanding into territories that are directly competing with the UFC, so they don't have to worry about them. So as long as the two are not in competition, I think they can be on friendly terms.
All right. Our next question comes from Endorphin. That's INDORFIN on Blue Sky. His question is, how much time does one's new cash infusion buy them? Any ideas why someone continues to give them money? I heard that they're getting stock at a discounted price, but surely that stock is worthless, right?
Well, I wouldn't say the person you heard it from, hopefully, is me when I post on Twitter. So the stock price is, yes, it is discounted. Now, we'll go to the first one. How long does the cash infusion last them? Well, they burned through over $500 million so far, it looks like. And based on previous cash burn rates, this would probably last them, $50 million US, 6 months to a year. I don't think their burn rates is high anymore. They've obviously scaled back operations. They're barely doing events outside of Thailand. They're barely doing MMA events. I think they've brought down their burn rate tremendously. So if all $50 million cash is available to them, they could probably last a year to 18 months, I'm going to guess, with that money before they would have to ask for more money. Or maybe at that point, they are actually profitable. People laugh at that. But if you scale back your operation so low that you're spending very little, you can be profitable. You're just going to be a regional Muay Thai promotion, which is what they seem to be heading towards. Which the people that put in now almost $600 million in them are not going to be happy about, but they could stay afloat doing that. Now, the question is that 50 million, there's a couple things I have a question about. One, their shares are in US dollars, not in Singapore dollars. The other shares come out to about $16 or $17 a share based on the amount of capital they've put in. That's the value they're at. The total, which also would make the company, I guess, at $1.3 billion or $1.4 billion, or over $1 billion US dollars in value. But the new shares in US dollars, they bought them for $1 a share, right? Which would make the company basically like under 100 million in total value if that was the new dollar value per share. So the question is, why is it in US dollars? Why do they do it this way? Is it to make it look like they didn't do a sell down, that they didn't cut the price, knock down the price of the shares, so the value of the company is much lower? So they kept in dollars to make it look like it's a special infusion. That's possible. The other possible, just as possible, this couldn't possibly be some sort of loan, a note that they got that's not really a direct investment of cash, and that certain targets have to be hit before the money's available. We don't know for sure. I'm looking for any information. It's even hard to know exactly where the money comes from because they still have the Cayman Islands one. So the investment actually goes to the Cayman Islands, and then that money goes to the Singapore company. And so we don't know exactly the breakdown of the money. We do not know if it's an actual, if it's a loan, what the purpose of the equity is. So there's a lot of questions we have, but I guess the question is, so I don't know what's going to happen with one, I guess, the simplest way to put it. I think they can survive as long as they want, if they go as cheap as they are, but that's not why people put money in the company. They put money because they were going to be a duopoly, and man, are they a long ways from being probably the furthest they've ever been away from being a duopoly.
I have an add-on question for that. Do you think they have any opportunity to con somebody into giving them more money?
I mean, they got this money. Who knows if they're going to have more money? I mean, the price of the stock, the shares, looks like it's plummeted, right? So I don't know that would make you nervous. Again, they've kept it in US dollar. Maybe the math that or not, but you would look at it and say, is this good? Is this good money? I can't believe anybody would look at their financial statements and say, oh, they just need a little more money. It's possible though. I mean, I just don't know. If they're going to sell the company or get some more or sell off another piece of it, maybe they do it at a discounted rate, and someone's going to acquire the majority of the company at a much discounted rate, which is going to piss off all the other shareholders because they just lost. They wrote off a lot of money that they put into it.
All right. Last two questions, both anonymously submitted. The first one, if my, in quotation marks, manager is asking for 10% of my settlement award in the lead class, did they do anything at all to deserve that?
No, this is disgruntled person not recognizing the work that their manager did for them. So, no, well,
that was
sadly,
a joke out there for those of you that can't read John's sarcasm. That was a joke.
Listen, there are people in MMA that do their job, that try to do their jobs as managers, right? But there are a lot of managers that are basically brokers. And I do not know of any manager. I'm trying to think in the league case. I remember they put out a bunch of, they asked for a bunch of discovery for managers, and I thought they talked to the judge that no one was submitting anything. Monty Cox, I think, was the one guy that submitted everything, and they didn't have to send another notice out to him based on this, what was filed. So it doesn't sound like the managers did much to work on this case, right? I have not heard I haven't heard any managers basically contacting their fighters and telling them, hey, this is how, this is where you go to get your money. Make sure you get your money. A lot of the managers, maybe Daniel Rubenstein has. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check, but because he did tweet something. But other managers, I know, and I mean, it sounds this way from people I've talked to. It sounds like they want their fighters to go through them to get this settlement, and that sounds like they're planning to take a piece of it. So, if I was a fighter, maybe if you know specifically that your manager did a lot of work to help the league class, or if your manager is doing done a lot for you, so much for you that you think he deserves a piece of this, even though he didn't do anything on it, then by all means give it to him. But I would recommend instead you contact the UFC class action yourself, submit the simple form yourself, and get the money for yourself without cutting anybody else in. That would be my simple suggestion. That would be mine as well, because why give someone 10% when it's your money? All you have to do is fill out a form. Well, I would also do what Eric Kramer and Michael D'Angelo suggested is you get the money first, and then you can decide if they deserve a piece of that. Yeah, exactly. But so, I mean, even if the fight manager claims I get a percentage of that because of our contract, get the money first, and then you can peruse the contract to make certain that he's telling the truth, that you signed over the rights to any lawsuit, because maybe there's a chance I think there's a very good, I think it's very unlikely most fighters signed a contract where lawsuit winning settlement damages go to their manager. Exactly, because it's almost like you'd be paying him twice because he did collect on the fight. Remember? Yeah, he collected on the fight that he got where you got underpaid, that you're now getting paid more because you were underpaid on the fight he negotiated. Exactly. So you should not actually have to give him, I mean, even if you felt bad, I wouldn't, because I've already paid you. Yeah, I not all, I mean, there are situations I'm sure where managers did stuff for you, like gave you a free room and board at their house for a while or something. Maybe if he went above and beyond, you could feel that he maybe deserved something because he did so much in your life. But odds are, that's rare that I hear a manager doing that. Odds are that that he didn't do that for you. He had nothing to do with the settlement. He got paid for what he negotiated. And also, there's a chance some of these managers we know we're talking to the UFC about how it's not helping the fighters' lawsuit, the plaintiffs. And I think a good chance they weren't helping the plaintiffs because half the managers don't seem to even know what happened in the lawsuit. But there's a good chance that some of the managers were actually helping the UFC on their side of the case. Final question. Why are so many fighters thanking Hunter Campbell? Are they being told to do so by Dana White or their managers? I was not aware that fighters were thanking Hunter Campbell. I was told that John Jones did, but I guess other fighters, that something now happens where fighters thank Hunter Campbell. Also, I went back and I looked, and there are instances where he's referenced as well in interviews and in the embedded episodes, like, I'll have to talk to Hunter about this, thanking Hunter for something or other. It's been happening in embedded episodes as well, because I went back and I checked. Yeah. Well, I don't think, Dana White is telling them to do this. Maybe he is. And I don't think maybe their managers are, but I don't think that's the big reason. The big reason they're doing this, because obviously Hunter Campbell has a lot of influence and power. And I think that this isn't an Al Heyman thing where, he supposedly had in his contract, so you're supposed to thank him. But
wait,
I think
back up. What?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have to look, but Al Heyman contract, supposedly the claim was always that you were contractually obligated to thank him or something. I don't know if that's true. I really don't. And
I want to believe that it is, because that is so petty. I love it.
Yeah, well, it's a PR thing too, in a weird way. It's a sales pitch to other guys to have him as an advisor.
Yeah, but still, that's just wildly petty to put it in the contract.
I have some of his advisor agreements too from court. I should look through them and see if it says that anymore. But that's always been the story, that you required contractually to thank him. And I'm pretty positive no one's contractually obligated to thank Hunter Campbell. I think it is fighters just want to be on his good side. Fighters know that he's the guy. Dana White's doing other stuff now, worried about slap fighting and all the other shit he's got going on. And Hunter Campbell's the guy that I have to negotiate my contracts with. He's the guy I have to get a fight from. He's the guy that talks to the matchmakers. So I better be in good graces with them to get the best I can, because he holds a lot more leverage than I have in the situation. So I do not want him mad at me. And I think that's the simple thing, is that, it is not a level playing field. I mean, we laugh about the Al Heyman thing, but it is interesting how many major boxing stars can just badmouth their promoter. You see it left and right. Bob Arum just calling him, Ryan Garcia just going after Oscar.
Bud Crawford and Bob Arum going at it too. Just on the line, every promoter has there's guys that go after Eddie Hearn, and everyone has someone that goes after him and bitches about him. Why under contract with him? It shows you the level playing field, because if in the UFC guys are scared shitless to go after Hunter or Dana White because they know they have all the power. In boxing, you're like, I don't care if I piss you off, because eventually I'll just go somewhere else. There's who doesn't catch a lot of heat in boxing? Frank Warren. I wonder why.
Yeah, he doesn't. Well, I mean, some of Eddie Hearn guys have gone after him. I know that. But
he doesn't take anywhere near the heat other boxing promoters do.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, right now he is the guy that's the conduit to the Saudis.
Yeah.
So maybe he's like, I want that big Saudi purse. I better be good to him.
All right, I have a addition to our last question about Hunter Campbell from myself. Earlier this year, for new listeners, John and I did an episode where we looked at Fight Inc. or UFC Fight Inc., whatever that docu-series that they did was, that UFC produced documentary that they put out earlier this year. And in that, we examined if they were gearing up for Hunter Campbell to, at some point, replace Dana White. So my question to you is, we did that earlier this year, at least 6 months ago. In the 6 months since then, what are your thoughts on Hunter Campbell replacing Dana White?
Well, I think it seems like Dana White's going to be around for a while, but it looks like they're making Hunter take up more and more of this company. Like he is filling a spot for Dana as he recedes. The other guy too, not noticed, is if you look at a lot of the earnings report, the transcript from the earnings hearing, the quarterly report, or certain, I can't remember if it's a Sports Business Journal interview, but people name drop Lawrence Epstein in those places a lot. Where he's now a major component of the UFC team. They brag about our team, how solid it is, and he's one of the guys they name. But he's not a public face for the fans for the UFC. So one way I think about it is that Dana White, they're going to keep him around as this figurehead, and he does the important kind of, stepping in the limelight things. But a lot of the responsibility that Dana White was used for, I think they're moving it off to Hunter Campbell for the fight business stuff and the stuff, the public facing, the negotiation part. And on the business side is the person they want to present to, people thinking about investing or want to do maybe business interviews with the UFC, Lawrence Epstein.
Okay. another side question real quick. Who is swinging the bat harder here? Is it Lawrence Epstein or Mark Shapiro?
Well, Mark Shapiro's with Endeavor. He's a higher ranked guy. They use him more often. He's cited more often. But for when they talk about the UFC, when they talk about how, they had a comment, I think, in there where they're talking about how our team, we have such a strong team, like a bunch of superstars or, all stars. I can't remember their exact phrasing. They listed like 4 people, and one of them was, Dana White and Lawrence Epstein. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty, they've done that several times. I noticed, not in the stuff that goes out to the fans, not when they're talking about a replacement for Dana White. Not, Hunter Campbell has now become the major, when they do these documentaries and stuff. Hunter Campbell is the guy you see, but when it's the trades, when it's stuff talking directly to people that talk the business, Epstein's name comes up.
Do you think Hunter's youth is part of the equation in the possible replacement of Dana White in that business sense behind the scenes?
No, I don't know if it's youth per se. I mean, he is younger. You want a guy that replace Dana White to be younger, but I think the big thing is he's just a guy he is hands-on in the UFC. He's dealing with the fighters. Because he's dealing with the fighters, because he's taken this position, the media, MMA fans and media now notice him and pay more attention to him.
They talked about Hunter being a real shark of an attorney at some point in that documentary.
Oh yeah, a lot of them background. I mean, the thing is, Hunter, he fits the need for like the people that are interested in how the fights are made and who negotiates them. But I don't get a sense he's going to take Dana's spot as this front man. Right. He doesn't have that kind of. Yeah. And I think that's their. I mean, the future to me would be that there's not going to be a front man like that. Mm-hmm. They will split the job up amongst multiple people, and Dana. Not that Dana's really doing that job now, but the other people will step forward to address issues for those branches. And they will not have a ringmaster like they did with Dana, this figurehead that they had. Or again, Dana White. I mean, he might stick around for a long time.
I think that's going to be the case. Listen, he's over there and he's working furiously on that body to make sure that from the neck down, he doesn't look his 54 or 55 years. He does red light therapy on his face. Women out there know what red light therapy is. It's an anti-aging device. It's supposed to reverse wrinkles and sagging. It's supposed to help with age spots and things like that. He does all these things to maintain youth. And most notoriously is the way that he collects influencers and hangs out with a much younger crowd. He is trying to reverse time. It's clear. And so my thing is that they're only gearing Hunter up for behind the scenes. I think Dana's going to be around for a long time.
Well, I mean, I think Hunter could step in front of the limelight to cover the stuff when they want to talk about a fight announcement or something. Mm-hmm. I think Dana's going to be there. And another thing makes me think they're going to keep Dana around. They do a lot of stuff to make him happy. They got, he wanted slap fighting. They're doing slap fighting. He has this, I can't remember what the alcohol he got involved in. They're doing
Howlerhead.
If he wants, he'll probably get involved in boxing because of Dana White. So they're going to give him stuff to keep him occupied just so he's part of the company and they can keep plastering him out, put him out there when they need him. But I think behind the scenes, as much as they want to present Dana's, hands are on everything, fingers are on everything. I don't know if his fingers are on everything anymore.
All right. So John, do you have any final thoughts for our big Thanksgiving extravaganza for all our fans?
Well, I got one final thing, one final question that was presented to me, and it was in a text, so I can't. But he was just really for the bonus, the listeners that stuck to the end. Who were the highest paid UFC fighters ever? It's career wise and per fight. And I went through it, and we'll probably at the end of the year try to compile a better list, especially for this year. But best of my knowledge, the highest paid fighter ever, based on several good sources. In fact, probably the same sources as Daniel Cormier got, because he got very close to the same numbers I did once when he said it. Is Conor McGregor is the highest paid fighter with over 20 million against Khabib, just a little over 20 million for Khabib, with a fight that did over 2 million pay-per-view buys, which, sounds like a lot, but you see about the amount of money that generated. Career-wise, he's probably approaching 80 million in his career. Approaching 100 million. He's probably got over 100 million in his career. Conor McGregor, the only fighter to break 100 million in his UFC career. The second highest paid fighter was slightly over 10 million twice, Khabib. Multiple sources on that and that was a large portion that came because he fought in the United Arab Emirates and they wanted him so badly. And then the third highest would be, I guess, John Jones against or Brock Lesnar, UFC 200. John Jones was gone at 8 million. I suspect, though, that John Jones will be the second highest paid fighter ever when we finally get any sort of numbers confirmation for the fight that he had against Stipe Miocic. So, but I don't put that in right now because I'm just not 100% certain. But John Jones, and if you want to say it, Francis Ngannou is probably in the same ballpark of 10 million based on his fight with non-UFC, though, his MMA fight with The Problem.
All right. I have another question.
Uh-oh.
Where does Anderson Silva fit?
Well, Anderson Silva is one of the highest paid. He's the highest paid fighter during the league class period. We can add up all of his numbers, what he got earned during that period. And his career earnings for his career during the league period, I think it was 32 million, 33 million, somewhere over 30 million he made during that class period. So he'll get over 10 million in the settlement, his share of it. And you add the years before and the fights before and after in the UFC, he is probably close to a 40 million career earning. So beats George St. Pierre, I think, slightly. But he had more fights than that. And then he's less than John. I think the John Jones calculation we came up with was he's in the close to 60 million for his career.
Did he do better in the era where Ronda Rousey was?
Yeah, that's his peak when he fought. Okay. I think his highest purse was 4.6 million.
Okay.
Versus Chris Weidman.
Okay.
So, and it's funny too because people will talk about, people still cite this. They'll say, "Oh, he made 7 million in a fight once." And no. I mean that's the other interesting thing is all these people will bring up numbers said by the fighters and a lot of, I don't know why, but there are several fighters that bring up purse amounts. Anderson Silva is not one of them. He didn't bring up this amount, but other fighters will talk about their purses and fans will cite it and go, then you look up and goes, that doesn't seem accurate. You did not make that amount. Rampage Jackson did not make 5 million versus Chuck Liddell. And we know because the lawsuit, we can look up the numbers and kind of interpret. Now, people say, "Oh, the UFC, they're hiding the money." Well, where are they hiding the money? We have all the other stuff in the P&L. We see their profits. Do they not make that much in profits that year? Where they have other expenses they're bearing it in? I don't think that's true. I think for whatever reason, some fighters, a handful of fighters, exaggerated what they make. Most do not. And the thing about Anderson Silva is interesting too. That 7 million number, I know where it comes from. There was people kept citing he made 7 million, but there was a article, actually, Chael Sonnen brought it up, but really the original source was a Brazilian article claimed that he made 7 million. And then if you look at that Brazilian article from back when he got it, you realize it's talking about Brazilian real dollars. And you do the conversion, and that's 4 million that he actually made.
The real, yeah. Okay.
So that the amount, the thing was accurate, but you have to do the conversion rate, and that's where the accurate number comes from. The same thing with George St. Pierre. At one point, said he made 5 million.
It was Canadian.
Then you do the Canadian at the time with the Canadian dollars worth. You go, oh, it lines up exactly, basically, with what the record shows he made.
I can understand the Anderson Silva one a little better because it looks like it's saying real dollars instead of real.
Yeah.
So I can understand how people would err there, but to err for George St. Pierre, that's harder for me because it plainly says CAD.
Yeah, and that's the that's just
Canadian dollar.
Well, it was in an interview where he said that he made, but it was in an interview when he's speaking to a Canadian media.
And I bet he was speaking French too.
And he was speaking French too. Yeah. So when he's talking to dollars, you have to think, well, he must be talking about Canadian dollars.
Yeah.
You would specifically point out that you're talking American dollars to a Canadian audience at that point.
Yeah, I wouldn't, especially if I was speaking French. They would know.
But yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I can't reveal as there's certain things we know we got to keep unreported for now. But because of Discovery, because of thankfully to a lot of people in the business that have shared information. It's because of the financials, with the SEC and stuff. Now we have a pretty good idea what a lot of guys, at least ballpark figure made. And we know specific numbers for basically everybody's purse to a large degree from 2011, 2016 for sure. And beyond that as well for bits.
John gets lots of things whispered in his ear. So we have to also thank John for establishing the communication highway with everyone and keeping things locked in the vault. I love that.
What's interesting, too, is people aren't aware is sometimes, and this is hilarious, sometimes fighter contracts are negotiated at the event last minute. When there's other fighters around and managers, usually because it's harder to get information out of the UFC than it is boxing because less people know. But every once in a while, you'll have a situation where multiple people know exactly what each other is making.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't, you just got to get one of those people to share it. Suddenly you got the purse information for 3 or 4 people.
There you have it.
And then you have the contractual terms you can apply to the next fight. And you can go, oh, wait, this adds up. And so it also helps when someone gives you information and then you confirm it later and it matches exactly. Again, if you go back in time, I was told what Conor McGregor made years ago, right? And I was off. I think I said it was like $8 million he was getting. And everybody's talking about Conor was making $20 million at the time. Well, lo and behold, the UFC pay comes out from the antitrust lawsuit, and it's actually just under $7 million he was making. And I think I said it was $7 to $8 million at the time. So the information I got from the people that told me, I'm like, well, that information has been kind of supported by evidence now. I'm more trusting of what they have to say.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I love when your little birds come and whisper to you because your little birds are almost always accurate. I mean, can you even remember a time when a little birdie wasn't?
I am trying to remember. I know there's been 1 or 2 where they were way off. Well, Brock Lesnar was one where we said it was $8 million before it got disclosed in the lawsuit, but I was not the only one. There were people. What was funny is people in the pro wrestling world were sharing that number, and everybody in MMA was kind of ignoring it.
Wow.
I guess no one could believe that someone would get paid that much
from the UFC.
Yeah, from the UFC. Yeah. So, but it's I'm sure there's some that I've now. Let's pretend I never got any wrong. That no one ever gave me some bad information.
All little birdies were truthful. All right. So that's going to wrap us up. We have occupied, let's see here, an hour and a half of your Thanksgiving weekend. We hope you've enjoyed it. We would love to do more of these. Always submit us your questions. Do me a favor, follow this guy on Twitter. He is the most informative person you could possibly follow. On Twitter, he's Hey Not the Face. He is also on Blue Sky and active on Blue Sky, which is a breath of fresh air over there, by the way. And it's growing so fast. But on Blue Sky, he is also Hey Not the Face. Same over on Threads. On Twitter, I am Crooklyn MMA. On Blue Sky, I'm Crooklyn. And on Threads, I am Crooklyn949. Our messages are open. So if you have questions, comments, suggestions, shoot them our way. You may find yourself mentioned right here on the show. Shout out to Fred Garvin, who asked how much we could bench. I would go out on a limb and say both of us could probably bench our cats. And
well, I gotta say, let me see how much I haven't benched in a while. My peak was over 300 when I was young. 315, I think, is my peak. But nowadays, I think the last time I don't do above. I'm old and feeble, and I don't do above 220. I don't think. I mean, I do multiple. I won't go above that. I'll hurt myself. So there's your answer, Fred Garvin. 220 plus 1.
I have bone spurs in my shoulders, and I have not gone to have anything done for them because I don't want the downtime because it requires surgery. So I don't lift. Like I say, the most I could probably bench is my 20-pound cat. Well, he's not quite 20 pounds. He's about 18 pounds, but still. I have severe bursitis. Also, I had 2 people, X Spectrum something, a really nice guy over on X. He asked, Will Conor McGregor ever fight again? Well, no, he won't. And Bernie Musatelli also asked me the same thing. Will Conor McGregor fight again? They clearly did it to get us to say never, ever. So shout out to you.
I'm not
guys.
100% certain of that, though. I think his life is such a crash and burn that he might feel desperate enough to.
I think so, too. I'm at the point now where I think that he's probably suffering at this point financially and will need to. But again, I don't know if he can clean his act up enough to be able to, quite honestly.
Yeah, that'll be the big hurdle. But I don't know if the UFC will care if he's.
They would trot out his Weekend at Bernie's corpse at this point.
Oh boy, I might watch that.
So, you know what? I have to say, really fast, I watched a TikTok. This is way off topic, but I watched a TikTok that was singing the praises of a classic movie with Marlene Dietrich called Witness for the Prosecution. And the reason why she was talking it up is because of all the twists and turns in the end. And so she sold me on this movie, which I have not seen. So I am going to go and watch that, and I will report back because I'm sure you've already seen it because
you want some spoilers?
I'll take one.
No, I can't give you the spoilers. It'll spoil the twist. I know all the twists and stuff, but it is a very, very entertaining movie. Billy Wilder, so you can't go wrong.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to watch that, and I will report back to everyone on our next episode how it was at the very end of the show. But I'm pretty excited because I know that Zane Simon and John Nash and his brother are all classic movie fans and have very distinctive palettes about movies. So I feel like I'm actually in rarefied air by watching this movie. So,
yeah, it's not a bad choice. It beats all the garbage that's out there.
Yeah, it beats the schlock I normally watch just for quick consumable entertainment. So this is actually going to be something highbrow that I'm going to check out. So yeah. Anyways, on that fine note, y'all know the drill from here. Please subscribe and please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!